Gary, I have 11:02. There's still folks coming on.
Okay. I did hit the record button. I remembered to do that.
Okay.
So folks, if for some reason you don't want to be seen on a recording, you might want to mute your screen. And I really I'm serious when I ask that. Some people are like, oh, you're recording this? I don't want to be on this. So you might want to just mute your video if that's the case for you. And if you're running from the law, that's probably a really good idea.
And the other thing that I'll ask you to do is if you would mute for now, that would be great. So we want to make sure everybody is able to mute. And Gary, are you ready? Should we go ahead?
Let's do it.
All right. So thank you all for being here. We have folks from Scranton-Wilkes-Barre District and from Altoona District and Harrisburg District, as well as laity and clergy from Scranton-Wilkes-Barre. So it's good. I'm excited for this training. We've been waiting a while for it. I know it's been asked about in this district. So I'm glad that we're able to do this way today. And grateful to have Gary Shockley, who's the Director of Equipping Vital Congregations, with us this morning. And he is just going to take it away from here.
Woohoo! Awesome. It's so good to see you all and to be spending this time together, especially on a day like this. In Boiling Springs, it's just miserable. So it's nice to be inside being with you. And I hope that's true for you as well. We are planning to go till 12:30. And what I would ask is, because this is going to move along at a pretty good clip, and what I've learned from doing this 2 other times before this now, is that most of the questions people have early on are going to be answered in like the next slide or 2. So I heard myself saying, oh, just wait, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. So I think I'm learning that it's almost better to hold those till the end. And I promise you, even if I have to stay on past 12:30 and you need a conversation with me, I will do that for you. If there's a question for clarification or some kind of a technical challenge that I need to be aware of, go ahead and send me something in chat. And Judy's going to be monitoring that. And can I give you full permission, Judy, to stop me in my tracks at any moment? That sound good? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So I'm not going to be able to see you as well. But this has all the information on it. Are you able to see that? Yes? Okay. That's a good thing. So I call this presentation, this webinar, Simplified Accountable Structure Simplified, because what I've learned is that there are times when this is anything but simple. And I know that in the past few years, some churches have kind of adopted this model and have played around with it only to become incredibly frustrated. So one of the things that I want to promise you is if your church becomes serious about this and you want to take the initial steps, we have coaches through Equipping, Equip, Grow, and Connect who have training in this, who would be willing and ready to walk alongside you. And that's a piece that's been missing because you get about up to your waist in this and suddenly the floor falls out from under you and you are fully immersed and drowning sometimes. We don't want that to happen. So before we get to that point, we'd like to make an intervention. So I do need to preface this by saying, I've got 3 videos in here. And the first one I want to show you, and they're really meant, they're kind of humorous, but they're also very pointed. And they're meant to break up what is going to be an awful lot of information thrown at you. So I hope that you enjoy them. And I hope that you understand the point. This first video comes from an experience, I don't know where it is, but it's from a newsreel a long, long time ago of this huge whale that landed up on shore and died at a beach. And it became a problem. You can imagine the smell. And all the townspeople were just up in arms. And so the group of engineers got together and decided what they thought was the best means for dealing with this problem. And so let's just watch this and enjoy. Can you hear the video, Judy?
Division not only had a whale
Okay.
problem on its hands,
Yes.
It had a stinking whale of a problem. What to do with one 45-foot, 8-ton whale dead on arrival on the beach near Florence? It had been so long since a whale had washed up in Lane County, nobody could remember how to get rid of one. In selecting its battle plan, the Highway Division decided the carcass couldn't be buried because it might soon be uncovered. It couldn't be cut up and then buried because nobody wanted to cut it up, and it couldn't be burned. So dynamite it was, some 20 cases or a half ton of it. The hope was that the long-dead Pacific gray whale would be almost disintegrated by the blast, and that any small pieces still around after the explosion would be taken care of by seagulls and other scavengers. Indeed, the seagulls had been standing nearby all day. As everything was being made ready, we asked George Thornton, the highway engineer in charge of the project, for his final observation. Well, I'm confident that it'll work. The only thing is we're not sure just exactly how much explosives it'll take to disintegrate this thing so the scavengers, seagulls, and crabs and whatnot can clean it up. Is there any chance it might be more than a one-day job? If there's any large chunks left, and we may have to do some other cleanup, possibly set another charge. The dynamite was buried primarily on the leeward side of the big mammal, so that most of the remains would be blown toward the sea. About 75 bystanders, most of them residents who had first found the whale to be an object of curiosity before they tired of its smell, were moved back a quarter of a mile away. The sand dunes there were covered with spectators and land-lubber newsmen, shortly to become land-blubber newsmen, with a blasted blubber beyond all believable bounds. Our camera stopped rolling immediately after the blast. The humor of the entire situation suddenly gave way to a run for survival as huge chunks of whale blubber fell everywhere. Pieces of meat passed high over our heads while others were falling at our feet. The dunes were rapidly evacuated as spectators escaped both the falling debris and the overwhelming smell. A parked car over a quarter of a mile from the blast site was the target of one large chunk. The passenger compartment literally smashed. Fortunately, no human was hit as badly as the car. However, everyone on the scene was covered with small particles of dead whale. As for the success of the effort, well, the seagulls who were supposed to clean things up were nowhere in sight, either scared away by the explosion or kept away by the smell. That didn't really matter. The remaining chunks were of such a size that no respectable seagull would attempt to tackle anyway. As darkness began to set in, the highway crews were back on the beach burying the remains, including a large piece of the carcass which never left the blast site. It might be concluded that should a whale ever wash ashore in Lane County again, those in charge will not only remember what to do, they'll certainly remember what not to do.
Wow. I just, I just love that clip. I just love that clip because it's like when you have a problem, you really have to seriously stop and think, what is the best solution to the problem? Because if you use the wrong solution to any kind of a problem, you end up with a mess on your hands. And so in order to avoid that, if you and your church are considering simplified accountable structure, it is absolutely crucial to get clear on the why. Why are you thinking about doing this? What problem are you trying to solve? And is this the best way to solve it? I tell people all the time that simplified accountable structure is not the end all to every need in the church. In fact, I've probably talked as many churches out of it as I have talked into it. And part of it is just asking the question, tell me, first of all, what is it you're trying to do? How is this going to help that? If simplified accountable structure is the solution that you're looking for to the answer, how can we get more of our members engaged in active ministry and not just sitting around tables making administrative decisions? How do we employ and empower more people to follow God's call in their lives and help them to understand that being on an administrative committee, while it is probably a good use for some folks, is not necessarily for everybody. And so getting clear on why is crucial. So one of the things, if I were doing this with you and we had a lot more time, we would do a little bit of a Bible study. I've included it in the PowerPoint because now you have it. In fact, Saturday morning, I led a retreat for 2 churches that are looking at doing something together, not simplified structure. But I find myself almost in everything I do with groups going back to this. First, get clear on why. And the question, why do we exist as a church? And that has to be the foundational question behind everything we do. Why do we exist? And then we measure everything against that why and make sure that everything is in alignment. So for us to understand why, we go back to the founder of this whole enterprise. And I don't mean John Wesley, but I mean Jesus. And go back to the teachings of Jesus. And the 3 that I lean on most heavily are listed on your screen here. And I invite persons to get together to spend some time reading these scriptures and reflecting on them. And then answering the question, why does Jesus say we exist based on these 3 scriptures? And how can we form a why statement in less than 15 words that captures this? It's a little bit of a task, but it's a fun task. And a lot of light bulbs go on and some really cool things begin to happen around the table. And then from that, everything you set out to do gets held up to the why. Why are we doing this? Why do we exist? And does this help us in our existence, or does it get in the way? Same is true for simplified structure. So once we're clear on the why, the structure of the church, whatever one you have, needs to help you live that out with as much engagement from your people as possible, but without tying up all your limited human resources in meetings.
Take this and listen.
One of the things that I'm finding in some congregations is that they've moved to simplified structure without clarifying why they exist and how this is going to help them. What happens is they get frustrated because they end up doing the same amount of work with less people around the table, and those people get exhausted. And that is not the intent of simplified structure, as we're going to see in our journey together here. Administrative meetings are not the ministry of your church, but they're the accountability structure that supports the ministry of your church to make sure everything flows from the why. I will add this, that there are persons in your congregation who are spiritually gifted and uniquely qualified to help with the administrative work of the church. And so I'm not discounting them if they are sitting on committees, somehow saying that's less than other ministries in the church. It's not. We want the right people around the table, but we don't need everybody around the table. I think when I grew up in the church, my first church I served, I was 18 years old at Riverside Church in Harrisburg. So I had a crash course in what it meant to be a pastor, but also what it meant to govern and administrate a congregation. And honestly, for the first few years, I really did believe that the ministry of the laity was to serve in administrative capacities in the church, in this structure. That's kind of what I just assumed. And as I moved forward, I realized that was not the case. So the accountable structure, simplified accountable structure, any kind of leadership in a sense, your leadership board, whatever that is, really ought to flow in this kind of a pattern, which is to start with the why. Okay, we're going to do this ministry so that, again, reflected back to why we exist. When ministry opportunities become available or the church sees a problem that it needs to work on or an opportunity to extend ministry in the community, the first thing the leadership does is discern together what are the needs and do some research around how can we meet those needs. And do we have the resources, both financial and human resources, in order to meet that need? So one of the tasks of any accountable leadership team is to do that discernment and research. And then from that, plan and set goals in the life of the congregation, to implement ministry, to release others in ministry, to evaluate how fruitful has this enterprise been for us, And then to kind of take a higher view and to reflect on where are we now and what should we be looking at next. And so that cycle of understanding the needs of the community, the needs of the church, doing the research, setting goals, implementing, evaluating, and reflecting become really important. That's should be happening at every leadership table, but especially so in the simplified structure, as we'll see. So what does a simplified leadership structure look like in an organization chart? You see in every kind of leadership in the United Methodist Church, everything falls under charge conference, which is the governance agency of the local church in this simplified structure pattern. So the leadership board, the simplified structure board, again, is populated by 9 to 13 people. And those 9 to 13 people all serve as the church council. They all serve as the church trustees. They all serve as the staff parish relations committee. They all serve as the finance committee. So their role is governance, strategy, and accountability. So all of the committees that typically are created and separate from one another are all folded into the leadership board. So for example, when this leadership team is meeting and they're dealing with the trustee issue, they take off whatever hat they had on, whether they were just talking about finances, they take that hat off and they all put on their trustee hat. And they deal with that trustee issue and make decisions around it. If there's a staffing need or some other human resource thing that needs to be discussed, they take off their trustee's hat and put on their staff parish relations committee hat. And so you can imagine now the amount of work that is implied in the members of a leadership board because they're functioning at different levels. But together, the whole purpose of their work is to make sure that the mission of the church has been established, the why, that goals are set around that a budget is crafted in order to support it, that there's accountability in terms of who's responsible for what, and are all the ministries of the church lined up around our why, and their job is to make sure that things flow well. We're going to talk more about that in a minute and unpack that, but you can see where the other organizations, for example, United Methodist Men, United Methodist Women, typically you would have the United Methodist Women president or a representative sit on your leadership board, not in this model. You wouldn't have the Sunday school superintendent or the treasurer, the finance secretary of the church, or those kinds of positions. We would normally sit around the leadership table in our church so they could all represent their individual organizations. That is not true in this model. The leadership board is representing all of those organizations. They don't, each member of this leadership board, the 9 to 13 people, don't come representing one facet of the church. They are there to lead the entire church. So we'll talk in a moment about how important it is on the leadership board that each person on that board is tagged as a liaison back to these other ministries in the church. For example, let's just take United Methodist Women. Somebody on the leadership board, when the leadership team is organized together, they're going to look at the broader ministries of the church. Some of them will set up a nurture, outreach, and witness kind of structure. So some of the ongoing ministries of the church will be nurturing ministries, some will be outreaching and mission, and some of those will be witness. And so the ministries will kind of be grouped under those categories. Somebody on the leadership board, when it's organized, will be designated as the liaison to the nurture ministries of the church. Someone else would be designated as the outreach, another person as the witness ministries of the church. And their job is to be in communication to the leaders of those various ministries, help them understand where the church is heading and why, get to know what their needs are in terms of resources, what other questions they have or decisions that need to be made on their behalf. And that liaison then carries that back to the leadership board to represent them. But we're not just adding more people on the leadership board representing these various ministries of the church. The nominations committee, according to discipline, still remains a separate group. The pastor is the chair of the nominations committee. So we don't have the leadership board electing themselves. And then you have the pastor. And if you look at this model, this really gives the pastor more leadership responsibility than what happens right now traditionally in a lot of places. The pastor is the one who is the overseer and the principal person for accountability and communication between all of these lay ministry groups, the staff of the church, if there's a childcare ministry, those kinds of things. The pastor's responsibility is to make sure they are being organized and that they are in alignment with the why of the church and the goals and the process for the church. So the pastor who sits on the leadership board would be the person who would update that leadership board in terms of any of the needs that they are aware of or concerns or issues that happen in terms of staffing or other lay ministries. In a pure simplified structure model, the pastor has a responsibility for hiring and firing people. And I would always say this to a pastor, if you were wise, you would do that in real strong communication with the leadership board, so they're not surprised by it. But the pastor is the one who is tasked ultimately to make those decisions and to do that work. But again, in partnership with the leadership team. We're going to come back to this back and forth in a moment, but I just wanted you to see how this looks. So a smaller leadership board functioning as all of these committees would function and making sure that there is good communication and linkage back to all the various ministries of the church. Sometimes people ask me, what about trustees? Because we have a group of trustees in our church that's very active. Are we just disbanding them? And I would say, no, you're not disbanding them. Remember, the trustees now formally are this leadership board. So what you retain or might retain is a group of persons who are serving to take care of the work of the trustees. So they're doing the tasks, but in terms of the final decision-making and financial kind of accountability stuff, that happens at the leadership board. So again, if you have a liaison on the leadership board who is functioning at, they carry the portfolio of the trustees, that person would be working with this group of active trustee types, right? To communicate, hey, this is what the leadership board is all about. This is where we're heading. How can we empower you? And how can we release you to do the ministry of trustees in this new organization? And as they're working with the trustees, I heard somebody describe this, that somebody says, you know what, the utility shed out back that we keep the mower and all those kinds of things in is just rotting and falling apart. It's becoming a hazard. So we need to replace it. Normally the trustees would just make those decisions and do it. The liaison from the leadership board would be aware of this need because they're in communication with this group of persons, men and women who are working on trustees' issues. That concern comes to them. They make the decision at the leadership board. Here's how much, these are the funds that would be available for that. Then they would empower somebody in this task force, this trustees task force, to do the research, to find out the right thing, figure out who's going to put it together. The liaison would communicate that back to the leadership board and then say, go ahead and do it. You got the money. Anything else you need, let us know. That's an example of how we're not going to disenfranchise people from the actual work of ministry and the things they enjoy doing. But we don't need a separate organization to do that in this structure. And we don't need more people sitting around the table. So again, I guess in a pure model, the board can be 9 to 15, no more than that. Each of them to serve a 3-year term. So when you start a simplified structure, you can't give everybody a 3-year term because in 3 years, they'd all be done. So you've got to stagger that. Members who rotate off can return to the board after a year. And that's just to make sure that we don't have a strong voting block. It's really important to minimize families serving together on the board, husbands and wives, uncles and nephews, brothers, those kinds of things. That's hard to do. Most of the churches I served in my ministry were very small rural churches, and they were families. So I've added this, if it's unavoidable, then family members will need to excuse themselves when there are certain votes that are taking place. For example, when there's an issue in staff parish relations committee conversations at the leadership table, one of those family members will need to absent themselves to say, I'll step back and I will not comment or vote on this issue, so that you don't have two members from my family doing that. That makes sense. Staff members are not to serve on the board. Family members of staff are not to serve on the board. And I think the reasons for that can be pretty obvious. This is a little bit down in the weeds, but at the first meeting of the new board, according to discipline, a trustee's chair will have to be elected, and that would be that liaison person. We have to have that for charge conference, a trustee's chair. And if you have anybody on your board, the 9 to 15 people who are under the age of 18, and I hope that you would, if you have that opportunity, if they're under the age of 18, when the board is dealing with trustees matters, that younger person than 18 has to step back and cannot be voting, because it is required by law that a trustee has to be 18 years of age or older. Again, the board serves as the 4 administrative teams of the church: council, trustees, finance, and SPRC. And I've already talked about, the nurture, outreach, and witness. The ongoing ministries can be organized any way you want to organize them, but this seems to be the simplest in some of the churches that I'm talking to. And again, it's important that the liaison is designated and is communicating back and forth. So what's a board to do? Well, leadership board's purpose is to exercise a leadership process and style that combines accountability, responsibility, and authority. It reduces micromanagement. The board members are not necessarily going to handle every little detail that comes at the table. So the days of administrative council sitting and talking about a $35 trustee expense for a new lock set on the front door is not going to happen, because other persons will be empowered to just do that rather than have the board making decisions about really small things. It actually, when it's working well, gives people more opportunity to make decisions and move forward, as long as, point 3, everything they're doing is in alignment. We don't want people going off in their own directions. So we're going to see later in this presentation that the goal is to help folks in the church. This is the problem we're trying to solve. How do we get more people to understand their calling and their spiritual gift sets and be invested in ministry through the church and out into the world, and hands-on kinds of things? And that's a pretty big transition. If everybody's been used to ministry being sitting around the table making decisions, then this is going to be a shock for a while. So it takes some, I've seen churches that have done sermon series, Bible studies in prep for this, helping people to understand we're reclaiming the full ministry of the laity of our church. And we're going to stylize our leadership in order to help that become more effective. And in the end, what this does is this really does empower the pastor to lead as well, because the pastor doesn't have to go back and forth seeking permission for a lot of things either with the administrative council. The pastor will be part of that team of 9 to 15 who are making decisions. And the pastor's job is to make sure they carry out their functions. So what does the board focus on? They're responsible for setting the budget, confirming the vision together, which is then cast by the pastor and the leadership out through the life of the church. Again, working in partnerships with programs and ministries to make sure that they're in alignment and they have the resources they need. And the board's responsibility is to work with the district superintendent to make sure the pastor is held accountable for their work as the pastoral leader of the church. So what's different about this is the team is not responsible for hearing reports. There's very little report out. Early on in ministry, everybody came and we went around the table, Sam, Sue, Henry, Tom, what do you got going on? And each person would make a report, and we'd have lengthy conversations about it. And if there was a decision, we would talk about that and make a decision. And that's how meetings go from 60 minutes to 90 minutes to 2 hours through all of that. So there is another way of handling these reports that I think you might like. We'll get to that in a moment. What's really important in this, and I can't say it too many times, is you have to over communicate when you move to this model. Because at first, people who are on the board in the various committees of the church will say, gosh, when I was on those committees, I knew what was happening. And now that I'm not on it, I don't know what's happening anymore. I feel completely out in the dark and disenfranchised. And the only way to make sure that doesn't happen is to over communicate, and through every vehicle available in the life of the church. When this isn't happening, we know about it right away, because there's almost a massive uprising of people feeling like the board is doing things in secret. I will add here that anybody is invited to come to one of these board meetings. And early on, you want to invite people to come and kind of look in as the board is learning its new role. It'll be a little sloppy at first, but just picture people coming and they're not sitting at the table with the board. Maybe they're sitting on the perimeter of the room, or one step back. And they're there to observe, not to ask questions, to make comments, and certainly not to vote. Unless the leadership team asks, what are your thoughts, or do you have anything to say about it? It's not a place, it's not a town hall for conversation and discussion. And it's certainly not a place where we would ask for a group vote around certain items, because it's the leadership board's responsibility to do that. That's a big deal. That's a big change for a lot of folks. And it takes a while to live into that. The pastor's role in this is, again, to be one of the chief vision casters of the church, to hire, supervise, assess, and if needed, terminate both paid and unpaid staff. My guess is most pastors in our churches have not been given this kind of authority and responsibility. And quite frankly, most don't want it. This is not a fun thing.
You got that.
So it's going to take a while to live into that too. The pastor holds the staff accountable for leading their ministry areas and fulfilling the mission and vision of the church. I served a church in Colorado that had 104 staff people. And when I got there, the senior pastor basically was tasked with all of that. I had to set up a system where I had directors and eventually an executive pastor who was able to help with it. But I was responsible for every staff person in the church. And so when I went to our leadership board, which was a simplified structure, I didn't have the staff come and give reports on their ministry areas. I carried the necessary things to the board. And when there was a change that was needed, oftentimes I would just talk to the chair of the board, and we'd have a lunch conversation or whatever, and I'd run through this with her, and I would get her blessing. And then I would walk into an office and do what I needed to do with the staff. I never did that in isolation from the team, but I didn't have to burden the whole board with it. So monitoring the church goals and seeing how they're fulfilling and making adjustments is required as part of the pastor's job too. And this should almost be first or second, because I think vision casting is primary. But finding a way, setting up a process, establishing a system to help raise up new leaders for the work of ministry is something that we rarely do with intentionality. Mentoring, apprenticing, spiritual gifting, getting a sense of where people are being called, helping them to discern that, and then grow in a ministry area. Ideally, every leader, every person who's leading any kind of ministry in the church would have somebody who would be walking alongside them, being apprenticed for it, so that when there is a transition in leadership, it's not this huge problem, because this person has learned by watching and doing with the current leader. Okay, video, and I think I will take a breath and just check to see if there are any questions of clarification, but let me just share this with you. This is another one of my favorite videos.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family. This man right here is my
Oops.
great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family. Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy. Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs. Well, that's another thing altogether. Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here. And if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't no feeling in the world.
EDS, managing the complexities of the digital economy.
Okay, every leader in the church, every district superintendent, every pastor, every EVC director at times feels as though they are herding cats. It's part of the nature of the job. Let me stop and see if there's any quick questions or questions of clarification.
Gary, there's nothing in the chat right now.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know. This is Kathy Wilcox. I don't know about for everyone else, but the chat is disabled for me. I'm not able to put anything in the chat.
I wonder what's up
Same
with
here.
that. Well, I don't know what to say about that.
Usually there's a button or something for the host to disable and enable it. So I figured it was just disabled on purpose. That's why I didn't say anything. So
Let me stop sharing and see if I can get out of here and fix that.
Yeah,
It's
you're
sorted out.
good.
Fixed. Somebody fixed it.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah, because there it is. The chat.
Somebody just posted that it's up and working now.
Okay. All right. So we're good. Everybody's still on board? I know this is a lot, and I'm going to repeat myself so many times. You're going to get sick of me hearing certain things, but honestly, it's intentional. I get tired of hearing myself talk, by the way, but I'm stuck with it. All right. Okay, we're back here. I think this is helpful.
So Gary, there is a couple of things.
Okay.
The structure appears to be more of a challenge for a change of pastor, which does happen in United Methodist Church, and where you would put a ministry team or deacon in the flow chart.
If the deacon is on staff, then the deacon would not be on the flow chart. If a deacon is just is part of your worshiping congregation, but they have, they got the ministry of deacon, but they're not employed by your church, that's a different story. They could serve in a leadership role in that capacity. We do not want to laden this group, to have half the group be staff persons in the church. What was the other question? That was a two.
The challenge of changing pastors and having this structure.
Yeah, that does happen every now and then in United Methodism. And the unique things that happen in that is when you have a pastor coming from a church that has been doing simplified structure, and they step into a church that has not been doing it, to help that pastor navigate how to set up the conversation and lead very gently in that direction. It's a mistake when I walk in and just simply say, this is what I've been used to, so we're going to start doing it right now. That's not a good thing. I think it's part of the responsibility of the leadership board that when there's a new pastor to do some intentional onboarding. And by that, I mean, getting together with that pastor, hopefully before they actually, step into that role July 1. Reviewing the vision, the values, the goals, what's happening, how are we set up? Are we under a nurture, outreach, and witness? Who are the players in that? who are the various liaisons back to the ministry teams of the church from this committee, from this leadership board, just helping to bring that pastor up to speed as quickly as possible. And that might be a good place that when you have that, to have a coach, to bring a coach in, to kind of walk with you through that onboarding process. But that can be a challenge for sure.
And please define implement on slide 8.
Define implement on slide 8. And unfortunately, my slides are not numbered from what I can see here. Implement. Let me see if I can.
Kevin?
Yeah,
maybe you can-
I'll clarify. When you have the accountable leadership circle, starting with the why, the
Oh,
the
all
why
the way in the
discern
back.
you go through. When you go into the third one, you know it's the implement ministry. And I just would like your definition, because working with churches, I see how that means we do the work to set up the ministry and tell them how to do it and how to run it, and that it's and I don't think that's what you're defining it as, or maybe you are.
No, I'm not. That's right. Thanks, Kevin. No, it is. It cannot be, it should not be this leadership team's responsibility to do the ministry at the church, but to make sure that the ministry is being done and that the ministries are receiving the kind of resourcing and support they need to do it. So when we talk about implement in a broad picture, again, in a church, leadership is all about making sure we are discerning, making sure we are planning, making sure that ministry is being implemented, and maybe that's helpful, and evaluating it and reflecting together. So their job, and according to the flow chart, the pastor's primary responsibility on this is to make sure that that's happening. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.
So also, Victoria shared that a deacon is appointed clergy. Would we include other clergy?
Oops. A deacon is appointed clergy, and
would we include other clergy in the group?
I'm going to walk softly here. Again, if there are other clergy in the church, and they are serving as staff of the church, they should not be on this board. You can have a retired pastor, you can have a deacon who maybe is not serving in a formal capacity right now anywhere, or certainly not in the church, that you might invite into the leadership board. But as soon as they're hired and they have a position, they shouldn't be on it. That's the point, is we do not want to stack the board with staff paid positions. Those persons might very well serve as a support to the pastor in that role of implementing ministry and monitoring ministry, kind of serving as a subset or a task force. Are we good?
That's it for now.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me minimize my little box here. So, again, we were back at where the pastor fits in. We're moving on to a meeting agenda. This comes from the Arkansas Annual Conference. I like the way this flows. And I would say that if you were looking at a 90-minute meeting maximum, and it may take a while to do this before you can get to something that's 60 minutes long, but 90 minutes is a good amount of time. And think of how that meeting gets broken into 3 30-minute segments: loving, learning, and leading. So everything you do would be grouped under one of these. The loving part is the development work, because part of this, I love this intentionality, as these leaders are developing their leadership capacity, and they're also developing their spiritual lives together as a team. Think of Jesus and the disciples, right? They spent more time actually learning about the kingdom of God and how to live as a member of the kingdom of God than they did, active committee work. Where do we in the church help our leaders to grow spiritually and to develop their leadership capacity? Quite frankly, there aren't a lot of places. So this is built into this. So think of the first 30 minutes of your meeting as doing this development piece. And then the second would be the fiduciary work, learning about how are things going? What do we need to be doing differently? What kinds of things should we be hearing from our congregation and from the community? And this is where we measure our goals. How are we doing? Are we succeeding or are we failing? Do we need to make some changes? I think this is a great place to talk about how many new folks have been coming to us in worship online or in person when we're back to in-person worship. How many new folks are with us now? And how many have come back a second time or a third time? And what is happening with intentionality to help them become engaged in ministry? If we don't do this, we lose sight of the fact that we really do exist to help others find their way in into a loving relationship with God through Jesus, but also to find their way into the ministry of the church. And then, remember I talked about, we're not going to be sitting around the table giving reports from each ministry area, talking heads kind of a thing. The way we get around that is we create a leadership packet that's going to contain some really important resources that we read and study together before we come to the table. And I'm going to give you some very specifics about that in a moment. So the third component of this is the leading, and that's the generative work, which means we're generating some really good forward-thinking stuff. We're looking at the challenges that the church faces, that the community faces around us, the issues that are folding in on us. I mean, when COVID hit us, the reality of it back in March, all of a sudden the church was thrown into generative work and a lot of adaptive challenges or technical challenges in terms of, gosh, if we're going to be the church, we got to figure out a different way to worship together, because we're not going to just stop worship until this thing is over. So many churches had to move into, how do we do this online? How do we create packets and take to each household? How do we care for people pastorally when we're not allowed to visit them in person? And then what are the challenges of the community around us? How can we help with that? What should we be doing next? In a simplified structure, that would have been a really big part of the conversation, and probably on an ongoing basis. As Victoria and I are members of the full cabinet, there's a significant amount of our time that's spent in this leading generative piece, especially this year, but also doing the other parts too. Our meetings are longer than 90 minutes, but those three things show up. Here's a sample agenda. Start with an opening prayer. Now look at the L1 is the loving, L2 is the learning, L3 is the leading. So the first two pieces of this are that leadership development, spiritual development. So prayers, scripture focus, testimony, sharing how God's at work in our lives. How did we see God at work this week? How have we seen God at work in our community? Spiritual development and spiritual formation and leadership development. One of the books that some of our churches are using is a book called Witness Your Why by Jeremy Scott, and it's about evangelism in a new way in the church. There are a lot of other resources that my office can share with you. Our offices, Victoria is really connected very well with the general church in looking at resources that are helping right now to help leaders in their spiritual development and leadership development. So that's the first 30 minutes is 1 and 2. The second 30 minutes is in 3 and 4, which is a pastoral review of inner church goals. Pastor is going to say, here's how our staff have been engaged. These are some of the challenges. This is what we're doing to work around them. This is where we're succeeding. This is where we're failing. This is where we're going to try new things. Giving that kind of an update becomes really important in real time. And then the leadership packet, spending part of that 30 minutes reviewing the stuff that was handed out ahead of time. Not all of it, but what are the things that need to come to the table? I'm going to talk about that leadership packet in just a minute. And then the last 30 minutes is the generative work. Leadership team discussions about the challenges, issues, opportunities that exist. spending time at the end of every one of these meetings saying, what do we need to share and with whom coming out of this meeting? How are we going to communicate the work? Again, 70% to 80% of failing simplified structures are because of number 6 not being done. And then closing prayer, especially focused on the mission field. So that's a sample. And you can design that any way that you want, but it captures all the main components that need to be handled by this team. Now you notice there's not a lot of stuff in here in terms of, committee report backs or, tasks that need to be decided on. This keeps things at a much higher leadership level. So this is the leadership packet. This is what that might look like. And it would be distributed electronically or by paper, depending on where you live and where you serve, prior to the meeting. Packets might include, but not always be discussed at the meeting. Financial reports, this is where the finance report is. Doesn't have to come to the table for a vote. If it's been read and looked at ahead of time and there aren't any questions, then we don't bring it to the table. What are our vital signs? Average worship attendance, professions of faith, baptisms, missional engagement, small group, generosity. How are we doing in terms of stewardship? This ought to be a part of every leadership packet. We ought to have a scorecard. How are we doing? That third part about how are we connecting people? The minutes from the previous meeting, they don't have to be read aloud and discussed and voted on at the table. If everybody has them ahead of time and reads it, if there's a question, I get the packet, Tom sends me the packet, I'm looking at the packet, something's missing. I send a note to the other 9 members saying, I'm confused about what I'm seeing on the minutes. Can somebody help me figure out what that is? And so there's some communication that can happen prior to the meeting, so it doesn't have to happen at the meeting and take away time out of the valuable agenda that we have. And then special reports or ministry team updates, but it's decided by the chairperson as that person is relating to all the team members, which parts of the leadership packet need to be included on that 90-minute agenda. But trying to do as few of those things as possible. Okay, another goodie.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Okay, if you didn't laugh at that one, maybe you didn't get it or you don't have a pulse. What are you thinking about? Communicate, communicate, communicate. So at the end, that third 30-minute segment of the agenda is very deliberate conversation. What needs to be shared from this meeting and to whom? How can the board support the ministry, the pastor, staff, and ministry teams by keeping the congregation abreast of the board's strategic priorities and work toward the church's mission? Who on the board will communicate back to specific task forces, ministry teams, and such? And that's important to, at the end of the meeting, to say, okay, so who's going to communicate this to the nurture team, outreach team, witness team? Who's going to communicate this to United Methodist Women? Who's going to communicate this to the Child Care Center? And even though you've designated somebody, it's good to just rehearse that. Okay, that's right. So when are you going to do that? Okay, well, this is Sunday afternoon for the meeting. I plan to make sure that I have communicated to everybody by Wednesday. Okay, great. What about the rest of you, right? I mean, literally spending that kind of time going around the room, making sure, and then holding people accountable to the way that they're going to do this. The minutes of your meeting should be made available to anybody who wants them. So they have to be accessible, whether you have a special part of your website or they're in the church office or something. I wouldn't print them up and hand them to everybody on Sunday morning in worship. But you need to say, if you're interested in the minutes, here's how you can get them. Now, this is true. Everything can go in that except staff parish relations committee items, which have to remain confidential. You can't publicize those. And again, everyone and anyone is welcome to attend your meetings, members and otherwise. If they want to come and see how you're functioning and what you're all talking about, that's awesome. And I think probably for the first couple of times that you are doing this, you need to say, hey, we're practicing this. This is a new thing for us. So pray for us while you're sitting behind us because we need help. But also, after the first couple of times, people in the congregation are going to not be showing up in mass amounts once they understand what you're doing and they feel as though you're communicating it back to the church. Communication matters, leadership matters, clarity of authority matters. Again, this is just redundancy here. One of the things that I think is really helpful under leadership matters is we strongly advise when Grow, Equip, and Connect, and we're working with churches around simplified structures or any kind of leadership teams, it's important to develop a leadership covenant that lists the mission of the church, the membership vows, presence and preparedness behaviors especially. What are the values that we will agree on that will guide our behavior? And this, if you're on the leadership team, then you will sign and be a part of developing this covenant. I had somebody ask me and said, I think the last time I shared this, we have a member of our team who refuses to sign a leadership covenant. And what should we do about it? And my response was, of course, I don't know all the circumstances, is, try and have a conversation with that person one-on-one to find out what is their concern. What are they worried about? It might be just a lack of understanding or clarity. And once you go through that, if they simply say, I'm not doing that, I'll serve on the team, but I'm not signing a covenant, I think you have to let that person go. You do not need somebody who is that concerned about a covenant with other leaders to be serving at the heart of your leadership team in the church. So whether it's probably your very first organized meeting or maybe even beforehand, you have somebody come, and our office and other folks that I know can come and help with this. We have some samples we can send to develop a leadership covenant. And we recommend that every time the Simplified Leadership Board meets, laminate these covenants if you can, and pass them out and have them in front of every person in the room. And each time you meet, designate another member of the board to be the person who is monitoring this covenant as the meeting is happening. And you're giving them permission to just stop the meeting at any time to say, let's come back to this because I'm not sure that we're speaking to each other in appropriate ways according to our covenant. So they're policing what's happening in the room. Again, I don't see a lot of behavioral covenants in current leadership teams. I don't know that we're always holding each other accountable to our actions and our behaviors. So this would be good to bake into this if you're going to start over again. Making sure you understand what the roles are on the leadership board and who's the liaison to whom and how that's going to take place becomes really important. So back to the beginning, what is the problem we're trying to solve? The simplified structure designed to help your ministry flow from your mission and to release more people back into the mission field of the church and not spend a lot of time in cumbersome meetings that just deplete the limited amount of time that people have to serve in the church. That's really the gist of it again. So with that in mind, if the goal of this, the problem we're trying to solve is how can we get more people involved in ministry because we don't have a lot who are doing that. Ensure always that ministry flows from the why. And I like this. I've looked at a couple of different acronyms for the shape of people, how to help people identify their gift set and their passions and all that. This goes back to Rick Warren and Saddleback Church. I like it because These are the components. Help people discover their spiritual gifts. What gifts has the Spirit given you? Heart, what do you have a passion for and love to do? If people are given opportunity to do what they love to do, there's been a greater success that ministry is actually going to happen and they're going to stick with it. Ability, what talents and skills do you have? Do you know what are the various abilities and skill sets of the people who are involved in the life of your church? Do you have some kind of a bank that you're keeping track of that, so that when there's a new ministry being started or there's a need happening, you can go to that gift bank and go, wow, okay, here's some people who have those skill sets. Let's see if they're available and are willing to help us. Where does your personality best suit you to serve? If you are a very strong introverted individual and you do not like public speaking, then probably having you as the guest speaker when the pastor's on vacation just as a fill-in is not a really good idea. Doesn't fit your shape. And what experiences have molded you into the person you are today? And how can that help you serve God in a very powerful way in the life and through the life of the church? So helping people to discover their shape is part of the task. So when you do a simplified structure, it's not just about reorganizing that council and making sure you've got 9 to 15 people who understand what they're doing, but you're also going to have to pay attention to these, because if you don't do this, you're not going to get to the problem you said you're trying to solve, which is how do we get more people invested in ministry? So here's some spiritual gifts assessments online. I took some time, I went through all of them. And some were a lot more cumbersome than others. The Lifeway spiritual assessment tool is very, very thorough, very easy to take, and it's free. And I like that. Church Growth has another really good one. The Grow office, Kevin Witt and Kim Shockley, developed this curriculum, Living as Spiritual Transformational Leaders, Grow. It's being used in our lay leader development, lay speakers in the annual conference. I believe the first 4 components of the 8 chapters are all about personal spiritual development and understanding who you are and how God has wired you to be in ministry. So this is one that Kim's email is right there if you want to ask her more about that. This is a spiritual gifts discernment course. The last time I shared this, Stephanie Rupert at her church is offering this for laypersons. It's, yeah, let's see. Those are the dates. So, there are more of those things come up. We'll put them up on the website when we see them, but this is a really good starting point. And if you have somebody in staff who's allocated, at least part of their time is allocated for matching people with ministries, helping with this process, or you find a person who has a calling for this as a volunteer, it's really helpful, because their job is to help people get into these spiritual gift assessment things, figure out who they are, look at the various opportunities that currently exist in the church and make matches, but also help to understand what makes their heart go pitter-pat. God brought them into our church. They have this gift set. What is it that they are sensing God calling them to do? And so one of the things that I've done, I've personally, our family started 2 United Methodist churches, one in Western Pennsylvania in Cranberry Township, and which is thriving under the Crossroads United Methodist Church multi-site model, and another one in Central Florida, Hope Spring, that during the housing bubble burst, the mother church that started us kind of reeled that back in as one of their existing ministries. But as a church planter, I would have persons who would come and some of them would be really on fire about certain things. It could have been a ministry they did in a church they attended, or something that they've read about, or maybe God has been like working on their heart. And they would come to me, a person would come and say, hey, I really think we ought to do X, Y, and Z. I get a little nervous when I hear that. We ought to, meaning I'm bringing this to you and you all ought to do this. So what I started very early in thinking teams from the very beginning is to say to the person who says, I really think we ought to do this, say, you know, that sounds like it's got some merit, seems to line up with who we are and our vision and our values and our goals and why we exist. Go back and find 4 other people that you can talk to and meet with who share the same passion. Spend a little bit of time visioning together. And then when the 5 of you are ready, I'd love to meet with you. Now, 90% of the time, I never saw 5 people come back. And this was not meant to discourage them from doing it, but to help them be in a time of discernment with other folks. Because if God is tapping you on the shoulder, most likely God is tapping others on the shoulder too. But I'll tell you, when I did have those occasions when 5 people called to make an appointment, and I sat down with them, there was a sense of the movement of the Holy Spirit in the room. And there were some incredible things that happened out of that. Now, again, part of the direction that they needed, whether it was from me or another staff person, was to make sure they were in alignment with our vision and our values and our goals, and to make sure that there was good follow-up and accountability. I would say when I was a church planner, you'd be very careful who you just kind of hand things over to and give them permission to do. You don't want to micromanage, but at the same time, you want to create parameters. It's like in a bowling alley, you want to have the bumpers up so people aren't just throwing gutter balls one after another and frustrating themselves and everybody around them. So let's define the parameters and then set people free. I got one more video, and then we're going to have good amount of time for Q&A. I've used this video for years now. It's a good metaphor for starting something like this and what it's going to be like in the initial phases.
Some people like to climb mountains. I like to build planes in the air. I grew up wanting to be on a plane, wanting to be up this high. Sometimes the temperature up at altitude will reach 60 below. It's brisk, it's refreshing. You never know what you're going to come across up here. A&D, mallards, owls. These people back here, that's why I come to work. That's why I build airplanes in the sky.
We're not just building a plane here. We're building a dream.
I love this job.
I do a lot of things up here. When I look over there and I see that little kid, I look in his eyes, that's all the things I need.
Okay. It feels like building a plane in the air. I don't know of a church who has the time to just stop everything to create something and then make sure it's working perfectly before we start it back up again. We're all building planes in the air. So coaching is available. And this is a component that I think can become so helpful for you and will reduce some of the frustration and stress that comes with trying to do a new thing. So Kim Shockley, through the Office of Grow, is the hub of our coaching network, Grow, Equip, and Connect. We have about, I think, 35, maybe approaching 40 trained, mentored coaches, some of whom have an interest or an area of expertise in this. So if you become serious about this, then we can help make that alignment to support you. So I'm going to stop the share here so I can see your lovely faces. And
I'm getting excited here.
See what we need to talk about here.
So I have one question, Gary, and then we can
Okay.
up. When dealing with SPRC issues, what's the best way to dismiss leadership from the meeting? There was already a suggestion that that it be communicated that they'll be attending to SPRC business at the end of the meeting. So they'll be asked to leave when that happens. So are there other best practices that you could offer?
Yeah, and again, I'm assuming you're talking about when there might be a conflict of interest because you've got a couple related people on the board. And so one has to step off because again,
I think, Gary, it's when there are other observers in the room.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, that's great. I had somebody ask that question last time and I haven't added it to my thinking here. Yes, I think you are absolutely right. Whoever suggested that, you'll know that you're going to be dealing with that issue through your leadership packet as the chair is creating the agenda. So just put the SPRC at the end and dismiss people. The worst thing you could do is have them step out of the room and then call them back in again. You don't want to do that. Yep, that's good. Are any of you currently using simplified structure? Okay. How is it going? And what have been the hiccups? How's it going? How long have you been going? And what are some of the hiccups that you've had? Share that with, if you would. Jackie, I see your hand up.
Yes, my last appointment, I was told I was coming into a simplified structure, but before I got there, they switched back. So I sort of half looked into it, but now I came into another appointment with simplified structure. But with COVID, they didn't meet for a few months, and there was a issue that they were dealing with. Like every meeting was the same topic. Finally, last week, we had what I called a regular meeting where we discussed a lot of things rather than just the one item. But by listening to what we were supposed to be doing, that's not what we're doing. And I don't think anybody knows how this system's supposed to work. I invited them to this meeting and I guess Harrisburg's meeting on the 6th. So I'm definitely going to push it again.
Okay.
But if it's so different and you seem to be stuck on one topic because of one loud voice, how do you then transition to doing the loving, learning, leading?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, you want to minimize that stuckness and one person overpowering the meeting. And that's going to be a real task for the chair. And I'm hoping that the person is not the chairperson.
No, it's our trustee chair, but it was a lot of building issues I came into because of COVID shutdown. We had mold issues and a whole bunch of water damage issues that took like 3 months to resolve.
Yeah.
That we're still dealing with. So
I would think one of the ways that you might try this is to have the chairperson, this person that you're talking about, who has this burr in their saddle for probably all the right reasons. This is a big concern. And maybe another person from the council to meet as a subgroup in between meetings, and for them to hash these kinds of things out and trying to talk out the details to the point where this person who is wearing the trustee hat, maybe the designated trustee person, feels like they're being heard and they have the time to really work things out. They're just frustrated that they're not getting enough time to do it. So create the time by creating a subgroup that could just meet temporarily in between meetings.
Oh, we have Sunday meetings almost every week to deal with the issues on top of the bi-monthly meetings that are now monthly meetings.
Well, yeah. You've not been able to fully live into the model.
No.
And again, this might be a place for a coach to come who can sit in on a meeting, through Zoom or live eventually, kind of observe how things are working. At the end of the meeting, make comments in terms of how this could have been a little bit more effective, and talk through do's and don'ts, do a refresher like this. Maybe the first step is actually have members of the group watch this video. This is going to be posted when I'm done recording it. It'll be on our conference website, probably on the Equipping Vital Congregations new website pages, so that you can watch this with folks. But February 6th is another one where the Harrisburg district is doing one that Saturday morning.
Another thing that I've noticed, both churches that I came into that were thinking of or had enacted this model came out of the Matthew 28 program, and they felt they were pushed into it because it was part of that program. What are the other reasons for coming into this?
Well, my assessment in my second year here is I'm running into your story over and over and over and over and over again, which is why I created this. And I had to get up to speed pretty quickly on simplified structure because I was part of a church that did something similar to this. We just called it single board governance. and it was a stylized version of this, but I needed to learn this model because so many churches had been sold on it. And I think we did a good job selling it, but we didn't do a good job coaching it. And I met a church who had 12 people, and they came to a workshop because they were told they needed to move to a simplified structure.
They
And I
were.
said, "You're a church of 12 people." And that's when I started asking the question, what is the problem you're trying to solve? There are churches who are struggling with this because it's not the problem they need to be working on right now. And so if they can move back to the other model, which they are a lot more comfortable with, and that's going to be more effective, then please do that. And then we'll circle back again and try this again with coaching. But if I were a
Thank
pastor
you.
of a church where this thing is just, one hiccup after another, and it's just making people mad, I'd have to do a long, deep time of reflection as to whether I would even want to continue with it right now or move back to the other model until we're in a different place.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Gary, there's a question about the actual leadership structure. Are we still to elect a vice chair, secretary, treasurer with this structure, or just the chair?
Just the chair. Yep. So this is a good question in terms of the minutes, because if we have minutes, somebody needs to be recording them. And that could be something that happens on a rotating basis, or you could just simply say, as I do on almost all of my meetings, is somebody willing to take notes? And so we just open the meeting with that. Who's willing to take notes today, right? Capture the minutes, and work it out that way. But there aren't any other officers, and I know that leading into church conference or charge conference, when you're filling out the nominations forms and all of that, there are forms. I saw Judy from Marion Hartman last year, where they're stylizing them leadership forms around the simplified structure to accommodate that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Taylor has her hand raised.
So if I can just follow up on that for a second, we're through a merger starting into this process and trying to live into this structure. So the question was raised to me last week, if we just have a chair, if for some reason that chair wouldn't be able to serve or something happened that she wasn't able to be there or lead, what do we do with there not being a vice chair that would automatically step in?
Well, the simplest thing I'm thinking of is you elect another chairperson from the remaining group. And if for some reason the chair can't be there because of vacation or meeting or something like that, then you would just designate somebody as the chair of whatever meeting you need to fill. Yeah, I wouldn't be, I wouldn't spend a lot of time and make it more complicated than it needs to be. It means then if for example, the person who was elected as the chair has to step out permanently, now you have a seat available on your board. And you do have the ability between church conferences or charge conferences to elect officers. So you could elect another person to the team, and then again, designate who's going to be serving as the chair and communicate that to the superintendent.
So Kevin has his hand raised, but I wanted to share Dalton Factoryville. Both small churches have started with this structure and they're coming up to speed. And so far it's going well.
Nice.
So
Hey,
share that with you.
Great. It's good to hear success stories, and there are a lot of them. That's great.
Kevin.
You're asking how things were going and what's the experience. This is my second go around with it. The previous churches that I was at, one of them had it because it was a Matthew 28, and the biggest pitfall when it was instituted is when the trustees were lumped in, there was no sort of building maintenance group that was also formed at the same time. And so then, boy, there was a lot of trying to catch up, trying to do. But the one thing about the why was we found out that once we set up the simplified the simplified accountable structure, there really wasn't anybody interested in really doing the ministry.
Oh, yeah.
And so you set it up to answer that question. And then when you go, okay, let's go, it was waiting, and that would, and that's hard to overcome. You keep working, but that was the issue there. The second, now where I'm at now, they told me they were under the simplified accountable structure, but they were in some horrible hybrid that actually was worse than the full structure and not the simplified. So we're working to get that back. And it seems like the hardest things that people really grapple with is, how are we going to get the building maintained?
Right. Yep.
That seems to always be the first pitfall that has to be dealt with. And then also trying to get other people who are doing the things in the other committees to step up. So it's sort of what I try to tell them is, if you were a committee chair under the old structure, let me know, because then probably you're going to be the one overseeing that area. But now you get to determine who you work with instead of us telling you who you will work with.
Yeah, good. And you said something too that it bears repeating, that if you're only focusing on the structural change and you're not focusing on helping people understand what it means to be in ministry, that's when you're going to run into this dead silence in the room, because people don't understand. They don't understand their place now. It's like, okay, well, I every now and then somebody would invite me to serve on this team, or I did X, Y, and Z, but now I'm not doing that anymore. So, oh well. So I think sermon series and preaching and Bible studies and helping folks to understand that we all are called to ministry, every one of us. And God has given us spiritual gifts for ministry, and we're going to help you. We're going to help you live into that. And you're not going to get 100% of the people signing up for this, by the way, because it can be such a radical departure, but you're going to have enough that once you gain some traction, it can grow from there. Then you're doing those things in tandem, because then the structure starts to make sense to people. It's like, hey, because we're doing this thing that seems to be working pretty well, that's why we're going to be adjusting our structure so that you have more time to be about those things than sitting in meetings. But if you're only doing this, isolated from everything else, it's just going to be hard, I think. It's just not going to make sense, because we haven't identified what is the problem we're trying to fix.
So Dalton, Factoryville, Waverly, and Dallas all have simplified accountable structure that are working well. So for those of you that are on, those are some resources you can use as well, talking to folks in those churches. To elect someone to the leadership team still requires that vote at annual church conferences that the leadership team, except for SPRC chair, can. That's correct.
Correct. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Through the nominations committee. It's just standard practice. And I liked what you said, Judy, too. Identifying the churches who are doing this and it's going well might be your first conversation if you're interested in learning more about it, because you've got somebody in your district, or at least somebody in real time who's going through this and can share some of their insights. It's the beauty of being a connectional system.
Mm-hmm.
So this is good. We've gone to 12:25. Are there any other lingering questions? There's another church, Plains.
Plains. Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think if there's something else that, Kevin, you said about 3 things, and I wasn't copying them down, but there was something else that stuck out to me. When my first experience of this was when I was an associate pastor at Ingomar Church in Western Pennsylvania. And I was actually appointed by the bishop to be a 2-year intentional associate interim, which was fun. I replaced 2 associate pastors, worked with a senior pastor who had a horrible reputation, but was one of the most phenomenal persons I've ever known in my life, an incredible leader to work with. They had 3 pastors who weren't even talking to each other. It was a mess. And they handed this administrative structure thing over to me because they said, we have 83 people in leadership through their council of ministries and administrative board, and it's a mess. And we spent the better part of a year moving from 83 people to a board of 13. And then it took another year to fully live into that, and it was phenomenal. But I remember one of the things we did is we actually, and it was my idea, I was a little bit more risky back then. We had a funeral service. We had a memorial service for our 83 person governance structure. And we actually shared what we had learned and how we had grown and the things that were accomplished through that leadership structure. We just shared stories. And then we had a liturgy that we wrote of offering thanksgiving to God for that structure and then letting it go. And then we had part of that liturgy involved embracing this new thing that God was doing in our midst. And it was such a cool experience. So memorializing things, helping people to understand that grief does come with any kind of change. Moving to a new structure is going to evoke loss in some people's lives. Pay attention to that. Find ways, it doesn't have to be a memorial service or a funeral service, but find ways to help people let it go and embrace the new. Don't just assume that's going to happen.
One more question of finances. Is this completed in a different fashion? Talked a little bit about budget, but
Sometimes, yeah, I'm hearing from churches that are doing simplified structure well, that they'll create a task force to work on the budget outside of the actual council meeting. So that's where you can have a financial secretary of the church, or a person who's the treasurer, because you still have to have a treasurer. You have some other folks who are really gifted at finances in a congregation and understanding ministry. So you have maybe the council chair, you have the pastor, you have a couple of finance people, maybe another person designated from the council, and their job is to develop the budget according to the why and the goals and the strategies that are going to be deployed in this coming year. And those folks are working separately, and then they bring, not they as a group all show up, but again, back through the council, they offer their proposal. And in a meeting, that's where it would be discussed and then refined. But this model really does allow people to create a subgroup, and you bring people in who have a certain gift set, and their spiritual gifts now. You bring them in a certain subset, you energize them around a specific task, and then you release them. They don't have to be on that committee forever. They've done their job, and they've helped the church. I'm going to turn the recording off now, because otherwise I'm going to forget it. And that's what happened the last time I did this, and it was like 4 hours long.